Do you dare look straight into the face of evil when it takes the form of a woman? The dark days of World War II did not only produce male killers in SS uniforms, but also bred a cadre of female reapers, soft hands stained with the blood of tens of thousands of lives. In the concentration camps, they did not execute prisoners immediately. They let their victims waste away, dying slowly in hunger, disease, and humiliation. This is not a story of blazing battlefields, but of the cold hell behind barbed wire, where screams were swallowed by an air thick with the stench of death. And at the center of that darkness are four names that made even the post-war courts shudder. Prepare yourself, because what you are about to hear is not just history, but the living testimony of those who turned cruelty into habit and human beings into ashes. Olga Gulivina, a female prisoner who survived the Ravensbrück concentration camp, carried for the rest of her life a deeply engraved and haunting memory of one of the most brutal female guards, Dorothea Binz. In her recollection, the scene of that day remained as vivid as if it had just happened. An exhausted prisoner staggered past Binz and collapsed to the ground. The woman tried to get up, wobbling forward. But that was enough for Binz to give a signal. Immediately, she ordered her guard dogs to attack. They were large, ferocious beasts, trained solely to tear their prey apart until the victim no longer breathed. Ravensbrück was a special concentration camp built exclusively for women. Here, the female guards had full freedom to indulge in the most barbaric acts, from savage beatings to cold-blooded dismemberment with axes. The camp began operations in May of 1939. Under the direct orders of Heinrich Himmler, the supreme leader of the SS, its purpose was to imprison women deemed dangerous to the Nazi regime. At first, the camp held about 2,000 people, including 50 Jehovah's Witnesses who had been arrested for distributing leaflets denouncing Hitler as the incarnation of the devil. There were also many communists, former members of the German parliament, prostitutes, Romani people, common criminals, and even homosexuals. After only 8 months, when World War II broke out, the camp had already far exceeded its capacity. Life for prisoners here was a chain of unending misery. They were locked in cramped, filthy barracks, clothed in rags, constantly hungry, and plagued by rampant disease. Anissa Post-Benet, a member of the French resistance who was captured and sent to Ravensbrück, recalled that her first impression upon entering the camp was seeing women with ashen skin, bodies deformed by hunger and illness, and eyes that were empty and lifeless. At that moment, she felt as if she had stepped into a zone of death with no escape. The camp had about 150 female guards, trained to strip away all human compassion and view prisoners as nothing more than animals. They were taught that mercy was forbidden. One survivor recounted, "They did not shoot us. They let us die slowly from sadness, from hunger, from exhaustion." And on her very first day at Ravensbrück, Anissa witnessed a scene she would never forget. A cart piled high with corpses, stacked like logs. Their arms and legs dangled loosely, swaying with the movement of the wheels. Their eyes and mouths still wide open in a frozen expression of terror. To them, even livestock was worth more than we were. She sighed. That scene was the grim prologue to the dark days ahead. In a place where life was valued at nothing at all, Among the most hated female guards at Ravensbrück was Emma Zimmer. She had worked at the camp since 1939 and was responsible for selecting the women who would be sent to the gas chambers, which made her the constant target of prisoners' hatred. One inmate remembered Zimmer as a wicked old SS woman who often intimidated them with a mocking, sadistic tone of voice. "I will report you, and then you will go far away. Do you know where? You will be ash in the chimney." Arkin. There was also Greta Buzel, notorious for her complete lack of compassion toward the prisoners. She was once overheard saying, "If any of the prisoners are too tired to work, they should be left to rot." The irony was bitter. Buzel had once studied to be a nurse, trained to save lives. Yet, she found herself preparing women for death by the lethal Zyklon B gas. However, the most despised of all was Dorothea Binz. She entered the camp in 1939 as a kitchen worker, only 21 years old, appearing harmless to anyone who met her. Yet by the end of the summer of 1940, after being promoted to the position of cell block supervisor, Binz revealed her true, brutal nature. She took pleasure in beating prisoners savagely, often leaving them on the brink of death. In 1944, her cruelty was rewarded with another promotion, this time to the role of Oberaufseherin, or chief supervisor of the camp. Her authority was nearly absolute. Although she nominally had superiors, in practice she was allowed to do as she pleased, twice a day. Binz ordered the prisoners to line up in the yard for hours at a time. No matter if the sun was scorching, the cold was bitter, the rain was pouring, or the women were faint from hunger. During these inspections, they were forbidden to speak, to look at one another, and especially to make eye contact with any of the guards. The process stretched on for hours, as each prisoner's name was called to confirm her presence and ensure no one had escaped. These roll calls were exercises in humiliation and exhaustion, breaking both the body and the spirit. Binz was rarely alone during these inspections. She often stood with a large German shepherd at her side, a dog trained to attack on her signal. The mere sight of the animal was enough to fill the prisoners with dread, for they knew it could be unleashed at the slightest provocation. Real or imagined, the combination of Binz's unyielding authority, her relentless cruelty, and the threat posed by her ever-present guard dog made her the embodiment of terror within Ravensbrück. What had begun as the presence of a seemingly harmless young woman in the kitchen had transformed into the reign of one of the camp's most feared tormentors, a figure whose very name inspired fear and whose punishments often meant a slow march toward death. Binz was extraordinarily strict, ready to impose severe punishments for even the smallest infractions. A misbuttoned garment or the accidental dropping of a crust of bread could result in dozens of lashes. She always carried a whip in her hand, scanning prisoners from head to toe in search of any excuse to strike. Dagmar Haikova, a Czech prisoner, recounted one horrifying crime she witnessed. Binz noticed a woman she believed was working too slowly. She approached, slapped the woman to the ground, and then, without hesitation, took up an axe and began hacking at her repeatedly until the body was nothing more than a mangled, bloody mass. When she was finished, Binz used a dry piece of the victim's skirt to wipe her polished boots, then calmly mounted her bicycle and pedaled back to her quarters as if nothing had happened. The reign of terror carried out by the female guards persisted until the spring of 1945. When the Soviet Red Army advanced into German territory, on April 30th of that year, They reached Ravensbrück and liberated the 3,000 prisoners who were still alive. In the aftermath, Allied forces arrested all of the camp's guards, Greta Buzel and Emma Zimmer. Both notorious for their cruelty, were found guilty of war crimes and executed by hanging in May of 1947 and September of 1948, respectively. Dorothea Binz, knowing full well that capture by the Soviets would mean certain death, attempted to flee. Her escape was short-lived. She made it only as far as Hamburg, where she was quickly identified and apprehended by a British Army patrol. Her trial, along with those of other Ravensbrück officers, lasted for 2 years. The court ultimately sentenced her to death by hanging in April of 1947, while awaiting execution. Binz attempted suicide by slashing her wrists. She was discovered in time by guards who intervened and saved her life, but only to ensure that justice would be served. On May 2nd of 1947, Dorothea Binz was led to the gallows. She was forced to stand on the trapdoor as a black hood was placed over her head. The noose was tightened around her neck. When the executioner activated the mechanism, she dropped through the opening, and her neck broke instantly. Thus ended the bloody chapter of Dorothea Binz and her reign of terror at Ravensbrück, a name forever etched into the history of cruelty within the Nazi concentration camps. It was not only men who served as Hitler's executioners. Many women were drawn into the Nazi machinery, ready to carry out the most ruthless orders. Among them, one of the most infamous was Maria Mandel, the Beast of Auschwitz, responsible for the deaths of more than 500,000 people, including women and children. She was born on January 10th, 1912, in Munskirchen, Austria, into a family whose trade was shoemaking. After completing her education at the Burgerschule, Maria became known for her beauty and was well liked by many who met her. In 1938, through the connections of an acquaintance within the Nazi regime, she was hired as a guard at the Lichtenberg camp. When that facility became overcrowded, Ravensbrück was constructed, and Maria was transferred there in 1939. At first, she was trained for administrative tasks, but Maria sought something far darker: direct involvement in the abuse of prisoners. She took charge of daily camp management, ensuring that those who were too weak to work were sent to the punishment bunker. In that grim place, prisoners were subjected to floggings in sets of 25, 50, 75, or 100 lashes. They were forced to count each blow allowed, yet none ever survived to count beyond 10. Maria often stood watching, her eyes fixed on the victims. Intent on breaking their spirit entirely, her gaze was not merely one of authority, but of calculated intimidation, meant to crush the will of those before her. For the prisoners, to meet Maria Mandel's eyes was to court death. Those who dared to look directly at her would vanish without explanation, never to return. In many cases, they were sent directly to the gas chambers, their bodies later consumed in the crematorium. This pattern of deliberate cruelty and psychological terror became Maria's signature. She was not content merely to oversee the work. She actively participated in creating an atmosphere where death was both inevitable and terrifyingly unpredictable. For her, power was not simply in the ability to take life, but in the fear she could inspire before doing so. By the time she left Ravensbrück, Maria Mandel's reputation was firmly cemented as one of the most feared figures among the concentration camp staff. a woman whose name alone could spread dread among the inmates, and whose presence often marked the final chapter of a prisoner's life. After impressing her superiors with her brutality, Maria Mandel was promoted to the rank of female SS guard at Auschwitz, the place where she would fully unleash her cruelty. Maria controlled the entire women's camp, holding the power of life and death over tens of thousands of prisoners. One of her favorite tasks was selecting who would be sent to the gas chambers and who would be condemned to forced labor. For those temporarily spared, Maria treated them as pets, keeping them for a few weeks or months. Before killing them, she ordered prisoners to keep their clothing clean so it could be reused, not out of any sense of humanity, but, as she herself said, to keep them alive longer for my own amusement. Maria took particular pleasure in wearing pristine white gloves, then beating prisoners until the gloves were stained red with blood. She was especially ruthless toward women and children, believing they represented a threat to the continuation of the Jewish race and therefore had to be eliminated. Her cruelty was systematic and targeted, rooted in the ideology she so fervently served. In 1944, Maria was transferred to the Mulldorf subcamp, where she continued to torture and select prisoners for the gas chambers. The end of the war did not soften her actions. She remained relentless until the very last days. When Allied forces closed in, Maria fled to Austria, hoping to escape justice. Her freedom lasted only 10 days. She was captured by American forces and detained. In 1947, she was extradited to Poland to stand trial for crimes against humanity. In court, Maria denied her crimes, insisting, "I had neither a whip nor a dog," and claiming she had only followed the orders of her superiors. Her defense failed to sway the judges. On December 22, 1947, Maria Mandel was sentenced to death by hanging on January 24, 1948. At the age of 36, she was led to the gallows. The crowd gathered shouted, "Viva Poland!" as the sentence was carried out, marking the end of one of the most infamous female executioners of the Nazi regime. Her death closed a chapter of horror, but the memory of her victims, numbering over 500,000, remains a lasting testament to her crimes. The next story is that of Violet Morris, a figure quite different from the female guards who served in the concentration camps. She was a French athlete, born in 1893, who enjoyed a peaceful youth and received her education in a convent. From the age of 15, Violet participated in a wide range of sports, including cycling, swimming, weightlifting, tennis, and boxing. In 1914, she married, but soon divorced in order to fully dedicate herself to athletics. Violet went on to break numerous records in shot put and javelin throw, win national boxing championships, race automobiles, and collect multiple gold medals. She was open about being a lesbian and, in a radical decision for the time, even had both of her breasts removed to make it easier for her to fit behind the wheel of a racing car. Her defiance of social norms made her a target for criticism from conservative circles and the courts. The tension reached its peak when the French Sports Federation banned her from competition for wearing men's trousers. Angered and resentful toward France, Violet became an easy target for recruitment by German intelligence. She was invited to attend the 1936 Berlin Olympics as an honored guest. It was there that she was drawn to National Socialism and agreed to work as a spy for Hitler. With her wide network of contacts in sports, the military, and intellectual circles, Violet was in a prime position to gather critical intelligence. She obtained information on the Maginot Line defenses and strategic plans for Paris, providing valuable data that supported the success of the Blitzkrieg, the German strategy of rapid, coordinated military strikes. Her transformation from celebrated athlete to agent of the Nazi regime would soon take her down a path from which there was no return, as her skills and connections were repurposed for espionage and betrayal. When Germany occupied France, Violet Morris began working for the collaborationist police and the Gestapo. She not only conducted interrogations, but also infiltrated the ranks of the French resistance. Numerous witnesses later testified that she was exceptionally brutal, particularly toward female prisoners. Her extraordinary physical strength allowed her to beat victims into a near unconscious state with little effort. Among the French, she earned the notorious nickname, the hyena of the Gestapo, a predator who tore apart her prey without hesitation or remorse. For those who encountered her during the occupation, Violet represented both betrayal and terror. She had once been a symbol of athletic achievement and national pride, but now she embodied the image of a collaborator who actively participated in the suppression of her own country's freedom fighters. The combination of her combat skills, physical dominance, and insider knowledge made her a feared and loathed figure in occupied France. Her career as a collaborator came to a violent end on April 26, 1944. On that day, a unit of the French resistance set up an ambush targeting her vehicle. When Violet's car entered the kill zone, the resistance fighters opened fire, riddling it with bullets. She was killed instantly. Even after her death, the legacy of Violet Morris remains shrouded in controversy. Some historians have argued that the image of the hyena of the Gestapo was, at least in part, a post-war fabrication, an exaggerated figure constructed from rumor and propaganda, lacking definitive documentary proof. However, for many survivors and those who lived through the occupation, the memories of her cruelty felt all too real. Whether or not every accusation could be substantiated, the testimonies of those who claimed to have suffered at her hands continued to resonate in the post-war years. To them, Violet Morris was not a myth, but a vivid reminder of how an individual could fall from celebrated national figure to feared enforcer of an occupying power. The final figure is Ilsa Koch, the wife of Colonel Karl Koch, the commandant of the Buchenwald concentration camp. Ilsa was born on September 22, 1906, in Dresden, Germany, into a middle-class family. She left school at the age of 15, first working as a factory laborer and later as a bookstore sales clerk. Thanks to her beauty and her strong social skills, she quickly became acquainted with many SS officers. In 1936, under the recommendation of Heinrich Himmler, Ilsa married Karl Koch. By that time, Karl was already a known figure within the Nazi hierarchy, and his reputation for ruthlessness had begun to grow. By 1939, after a period away from the camp to give birth, Ilsa returned to Buchenwald alongside her husband. It was then that the couple began engaging in acts of exceptional cruelty. Karl was already infamous for his brutality, but Ilsa's presence seemed to push him toward even greater extremes. Together, they revived medieval forms of torture that had long disappeared from modern warfare and punishment. Among their favored methods were pressing red-hot irons against the bare skin of prisoners, shattering bones with heavy hammers, and administering whippings with lashes embedded with razor blades. These were not isolated acts of punishment for rule-breaking. They were deliberate displays of dominance and sadism. Prisoners at Buchenwald quickly learned that any perceived offense, or even being in the wrong place at the wrong time, could result in such horrors. The camp became not only a place of forced labor and starvation, but also a theater for the Koch's experiments in cruelty. Ilsa, in particular, seemed to relish the suffering of the inmates. While Karl's brutality was feared, it was Ilsa's enthusiasm for these punishments that left a deep mark on survivors' testimonies. She was not content to remain in the background as the commandant's wife. She was an active participant, often initiating acts of torment herself. The partnership between Karl and Ilsa Koch turned Buchenwald into one of the most feared camps in the Nazi system, not only because of the scale of death, but because of the calculated and archaic savagery that the couple brought back to life inside the Villa Koch, located within the grounds of the Buchenwald concentration camp. Ilsa gradually became addicted to perverse pleasures. She hosted sexual gatherings and prisoner torture sessions within her own home, sometimes in the company of invited guests, other times entirely on her own. To satisfy his wife's desires, Karl Koch ordered the construction of what became known as a pavilion of terror, measuring 40 meters by 100 meters. This structure contained multiple torture rooms, a 360-degree mirrored chamber, and furnishings deliberately designed to inflict the utmost pain. Every morning, Ilsa would take a stroll through the villa's gardens before entering the camp itself, ready to beat any Jewish prisoner for even the smallest infraction. Her reasons for punishment could be trivial: a perceived glance, a minor delay in work, or a simple error. One of her favored pastimes was releasing trained dogs on pregnant women, an act intended to terrify or seriously injure them. The brutality of this act was compounded by the sheer randomness with which she chose her victims, leaving the prisoners in a constant state of fear. Yet her most grotesque obsession was the collection of prisoners' tattoos. When she found an inmate with a tattoo she deemed interesting or unusual, she ordered the skin to be removed after death, and in some cases while the victim was still alive. The skin was then tanned and repurposed into items such as lampshades, book covers, and gloves. Ilsa's fascination with human remains did not stop there. She kept skulls and other body parts as decorations within her home. Reminiscent of the most disturbing modern serial murder cases, these macabre trophies served as both symbols of her power and expressions of her sadistic impulses. In Villa Koch, cruelty was not merely a function of Nazi policy, it was a personal indulgence. The building became a private stage for Ilsa's depravity, a place where suffering was turned into spectacle, and human bodies into objects for her amusement. For the prisoners of Buchenwald, the villa was not just the commandant's residence. It was the embodiment of unchecked, personalized evil. When General Patton inspected the camp, he ordered 1,000 residents of Weimar to witness the atrocities with their own eyes, from piles of corpses and starving prisoners behind barbed wire to tables displaying items made from human skin and shrunken skulls. Many of the civilians were so overwhelmed by the sight that they fainted. By the end of the war, both Karl and Ilsa Koch were arrested. Witnesses testified that they had seen prisoner skin tattooed with elaborate designs, sewn into underwear for Ilsa's personal use. It was estimated that Ilsa had been involved in more than 33,000 murders, with 5,000 of them carried out directly alongside her husband. Despite the overwhelming evidence, in 1951, she was sentenced only to life imprisonment for a set of charges far lighter than the full scope of her crimes. The verdict sparked outrage among survivors and Allied personnel who had seen the horrors of Buchenwald firsthand. While serving her sentence, Ilsa's mental state steadily deteriorated. She became increasingly withdrawn, often speaking of herself as a sinner, unworthy of God's forgiveness. Prison staff noted her bouts of weeping, long periods of silence, and repeated mutterings about the faces of her victims. On a day in 1967, the story of the Witch of Buchenwald came to its final chapter. In her prison cell, Ilsa Koch fashioned a noose from a white bedsheet and hanged herself. There was no note, only the stillness of the room and the cold. Final end of a woman whose name had become synonymous with cruelty. Her death closed a life marked not only by monstrous acts, but also by the disturbing truth that, even when confronted with unimaginable evidence, justice could sometimes fall short of the crimes committed. Back at Ravensbrück, the story of Dorothea Binz remained a symbol of the brutality embodied by female guards under the Nazi regime. From a young woman who had volunteered to work in the camp's kitchen, Binz rapidly transformed into a living nightmare for the prisoners. Absolute authority, a pair of vicious guard dogs, and a whip constantly in her grasp meant that even the smallest mistake could be punished with blood. Her reign of terror was marked by sadistic cruelty, often carried out in full view of other inmates to instill fear. Survivors later recounted that Binz took perverse pleasure in choosing her victims, sometimes making a public spectacle of their suffering. One of the most infamous incidents was the execution of a prisoner by axe, carried out in front of numerous witnesses. The sheer brutality of the act seared itself into the memories of those who saw it. A chilling reminder of how far she had descended into depravity. The power she wielded over life and death seemed to feed her cruelty. Prisoners spoke of the way she would walk the camp with her dogs, eyes scanning for the slightest infraction, a misplaced step, a torn piece of clothing, a glance that lingered too long. Any such moment could end in savage beatings, humiliation, or worse. When the war turned against Germany and the Allies closed in, many camp officials tried to flee or erase their involvement in the atrocities. Binz, knowing that her crimes would soon come to light, attempted to take her own life in order to escape the gallows. However, her suicide attempt failed, and she was captured, brought before a tribunal. The evidence against her was overwhelming. Witness testimonies painted a portrait of relentless violence and sadism. Leaving no doubt about her direct role in war crimes, her defense that she had only followed orders could not withstand the accounts of survivors who had endured her cruelty firsthand. Ultimately, Dorothea Binz was sentenced to death. Her execution by hanging served as both punishment and a warning. War crimes would not fade into obscurity, nor would the perpetrators be allowed to vanish into history unpunished. Even decades later, her name remains synonymous with the darkest excesses of power, and her story stood as a grim reminder that the atrocities of Ravensbrück were not committed by faceless forces, but by individuals who chose to inflict suffering. Her death under the noose was more than a judicial act. It was the stark acknowledgement that justice, however delayed, would always pursue those who committed crimes against humanity. Maria Mandel, known as the Beast of Auschwitz, represented a different form of cruelty, one that was both coldly calculated and perversely entertained by the act of killing. She did not simply end lives on impulse. She cultivated fear as if it were a tool of her trade. Prisoners spoke of the way she would prolong their torment, sometimes allowing them to believe they might be spared, only to select them later for execution. This deliberate psychological warfare made her presence in the camp as terrifying as the executions themselves. Mandel's methods went beyond routine brutality. She was known to adopt certain prisoners as if they were pets, choosing them for their youth, beauty, or talents. For a brief period, these individuals might be given lighter duties or spared from the harshest punishments, yet this reprieve was nothing more than a twisted game. For when her interest waned, they would be sent to the gas chambers or executed in the yard. Survivors later recalled the sickening unpredictability of her whims, an uncertainty that made life in Auschwitz even more unbearable. Her alleged relationship with Dr. Josef Mengele, the infamous Angel of Death, only deepened the horror of her reputation. Rumors circulated that Mandel accompanied Mengele during some of his inhumane medical experiments. Standing by as prisoners, often women and children were subjected to procedures that defied all moral and ethical boundaries, whether as a silent observer or an active participant. Her proximity to such atrocities underscored her complete moral bankruptcy. The combination of calculated manipulation, personal amusement, and potential involvement in medical atrocities solidified her status as one of the most feared figures in the camp system. To those who endured her reign, she was not merely a guard, but an architect of suffering, someone who could shape the fates of hundreds with a simple nod or glance. When the war ended and the machinery of Nazi terror collapsed, Maria Mandel's escape from justice was short-lived. Captured and brought to trial, she faced a mountain of evidence: survivor testimonies, camp records, and corroborating accounts from former staff. Witnesses described in detail how she oversaw selections for the gas chambers, ordered mass shootings, and took personal pleasure in the degradation of prisoners. The court's verdict was unequivocal. Maria Mandel was sentenced to death, her crimes deemed so severe that no other punishment could suffice. On the day of her execution, she faced a crowd in Poland whose voices rose in chants. A collective outpouring of the rage and grief her actions had provoked. Her death marked the end of one of Auschwitz's most infamous figures, but it did not erase the scars she had left behind. For the survivors, her execution was not just a moment of retribution, it was a public acknowledgement of the evil she embodied. The memory of Maria Mandel remains a stark reminder that cruelty can wear many faces, from the openly violent to the chillingly calculated, and that justice, though sometimes delayed, will find even the most ruthless of perpetrators. Violet Morris exemplified how war could transform individuals not only by turning ordinary people into killers, but by exploiting those already harboring deep rebellion and resentment toward society. Once celebrated as an athlete who broke multiple records, she shifted from a life of sporting achievement to becoming a tool for the Gestapo's espionage and torture operations. Her transition was not merely a story of survival under occupation, it was a descent into active collaboration with one of history's most ruthless regimes. Her physical prowess, once admired on the track and in the ring, became a weapon in the service of oppression. Witness accounts described how she used her strength with calculated cruelty, administering beatings that left victims barely clinging to life. Her notoriety grew not only from the violence itself, but from the cold efficiency with which she carried it out. For many in occupied France, the image of the Gestapo hyena, tearing into prey without hesitation, became a symbol of betrayal and brutality. Yet not all historians fully accept this image as historical fact. Some argue that the legend of the Gestapo hyena may have been amplified by wartime propaganda or post-war narratives seeking a clear villain. They point out the scarcity of definitive documentation to confirm every atrocity attributed to her. Still, in the realm of memory and perception, the testimonies of survivors carried more weight than the gaps in the historical record. What is undeniable is that her path placed her in direct opposition to the resistance, and in the end, this enmity sealed her fate. On April 26, 1944, a resistance unit lay in wait along a rural road. As her car approached, they opened fire, killing her instantly. The ambush was swift, calculated, and for those who had suffered under her hand, it was an act of justice rough, unambiguous, and final. News of her death spread quickly, igniting both satisfaction and controversy. For some, she had received the only possible punishment for her role in aiding the occupiers and harming her own people. For others, the absence of a trial meant that the full truth of her actions and the degree of her guilt would remain forever obscured. In either case, her violent end became part of the post-war narrative. A cautionary tale of what collaboration could cost. In the decades that followed, the story of Violet Morris remained a point of fascination. Was she an opportunist whose ambition overrode morality? Or a deeply embittered soul who found in war a license to act on darker impulses? Whatever the interpretation, her name continued to evoke the complexities of wartime loyalty and betrayal. Ultimately, Violet Morris's legacy is inseparable from the moral wreckage left by the occupation. Whether entirely factual or partly mythologized, the figure of the Gestapo hyena endures as a stark reminder that in times of conflict, the boundaries between survival, complicity, and cruelty can become dangerously blurred, and that, sooner or later, the reckoning comes. Ilsa Koch, with her perverse pleasures and unquenchable thirst for blood, turned Buchenwald into a living hell. Her presence loomed over the camp like a shadow that never lifted. A constant reminder to prisoners that cruelty could be both systematic and deeply personal. Survivors recounted the terror of simply catching her gaze, knowing that even the smallest perceived offense could lead to unimaginable suffering. For many, she embodied the very face of Nazi depravity, not just as an accomplice to her husband's sadism, but as an instigator who took pleasure in amplifying it. When the war ended and the depth of her crimes came to light, outrage spread quickly through the Allied ranks and the public. The evidence was overwhelming. Testimonies from survivors, physical artifacts made from human skin, and records of countless killings. Yet in the courtroom, the complexities and limitations of post-World War II justice revealed themselves. Despite the scale of the horrors attributed to her, Ilsa Koch escaped the death penalty. In 1951, she was sentenced instead to life imprisonment on charges that fell short of the full extent of her crimes. For many observers, this was a gross miscarriage of justice. It underscored the procedural and political constraints of the time when prosecuting war crimes often required a burden of proof that could be undermined by missing documents, dead witnesses, or shifting jurisdiction between military and civilian courts. In the eyes of survivors and their families, the fact that she was allowed to live when so many of her victims had died in agony was an insult to memory and morality. Life in prison offered no redemption for Ilsa Koch. Over the years, she became increasingly reclusive and withdrawn. Guards reported that she would often speak aloud to herself, at times muttering prayers, at times whispering phrases that hinted at the atrocities she had committed. She occasionally referred to herself as a sinner unworthy of God's forgiveness, an admission that, whether genuine or performative, suggested the weight of her past never truly left her. Nearly 2 decades into her sentence, that weight seemed to crush her entirely. On a February day in 1967, prison staff found her lifeless body in her cell. She had hanged herself with a white bedsheet, ending her own life without warning. For some, her suicide was a final act of cowardice, a way to evade the slow decay of age and the ongoing judgment of history. For others, it was an ironic kind of justice, a sign that her conscience, or perhaps the ghosts of her victims, had finally claimed her. Ilsa Koch's death closed a chapter in one of the darkest stories of the Nazi era, but it did not erase the questions her life raised. How could someone descend so far into moral ruin? Why did justice falter in delivering a punishment proportionate to her crimes? Her story remains a grim reminder that the machinery of justice, though imperfect, must strive to hold even the most monstrous individuals accountable, and that, in the end, guilt can be as lethal as the rope. The stories of Dorothea Binz, Maria Mandel, Violet Morris, and Ilsa Koch reveal that women within the Nazi apparatus could be every bit as brutal, and in some cases, even more so than their male counterparts. They exploited the authority granted to them to torture, kill, and humiliate tens of thousands of people, leaving behind trails of fear and devastation. War, combined with an extremist ideology and a complete erosion of human empathy, transformed them into the female harbingers of death of the 20th century. Their paths into darkness were as varied as their methods of cruelty. One began as a kitchen worker, another as a celebrated athlete, another as the wife of a high-ranking officer. Yet despite these vastly different beginnings, each made the same deliberate choice: to walk the blood-stained road of oppression and atrocity. Power, when fused with fanaticism and unchecked authority, became the weapon that turned them into predators, capable of unimaginable savagery. Dorothea Binz's swift rise from a volunteer in the kitchen to a feared overseer at Ravensbrück showed how quickly ordinary individuals could be corrupted when handed absolute power over the powerless. Maria Mandel's cold precision and twisted sense of amusement in killing highlighted the horrifying capability of calculated, organized cruelty. Violet Morris demonstrated how wartime chaos could be exploited by individuals already predisposed to rebellion and resentment, weaponizing their personal grievances against entire populations. And Ilsa Koch's grotesque indulgences at Buchenwald, from her human skin collections to her orchestrated spectacles of suffering, embodied the very depths of moral collapse. Each of these women served as a chilling reminder that evil is not confined to one gender, and that the face of a perpetrator can be as deceptively ordinary as that of a neighbor, a friend, or a colleague. The atrocities they committed were not spontaneous acts of rage, but deliberate, sustained campaigns of dehumanization and destruction. They acted not in isolation, but as part of a vast, organized machinery built to erase human dignity. Their ends were as grim as their deeds. Some faced the hangman's noose, others the firing squad, and some chose to end their own lives rather than face prolonged judgment. Yet regardless of the manner, their deaths carried the same unspoken verdict. Crimes against humanity will never be forgiven. And the perpetrators, no matter their status, gender, or personal history, will ultimately be brought to account. These stories remain among the bloodiest chapters of modern history. They are not told to sensationalize horror, but to warn against the seductive power of extremist beliefs and the moral decay that follows when ideology replaces empathy. Remembering them is not an indulgence in the macabre, but an act of vigilance, a way to ensure that humanity does not forget how quickly civilization can descend into barbarity when its core values are abandoned. In this, the legacy of these women serves as both a record of past horrors and a stark caution for the future. Through this video, we are reminded that history is not only a collection of dates and events, but also a mirror reflecting the deepest truths about human nature, both its capacity for compassion and its terrifying potential for cruelty. The stories of Dorothea Binz, Maria Mandel, Violet Morris, and Ilsa Koch are not merely sensational accounts of individual monstrosity. They are cautionary tales about what happens when ideology, power, and prejudice strip away our shared humanity. The value this video brings lies in its unflinching look at how ordinary people from different walks of life, different starting points, and even different ambitions can descend into the role of oppressor when given unchecked authority. We often imagine evil as something distant, something that wears a clear and unmistakable face. Yet, as these stories show, the perpetrators of unimaginable horrors may appear as neighbors, colleagues, or even respected members of society until the mask is lifted. By examining these women's lives and choices, we learn that cruelty is rarely born overnight. It grows in the shadows, nourished by small acts of indifference, dehumanizing language, and the normalization of violence. When prejudice is institutionalized and morality is replaced by blind loyalty to a cause, even the most heinous acts can be justified in the minds of those who commit them. This understanding is vital because it warns us that the seeds of such atrocities can be sown anywhere, and it is our duty to recognize and challenge them before they take root. The video also delivers an enduring message about accountability, the fact that these women were eventually confronted with justice, whether by trial, execution, or the weight of their own guilt, reinforces a critical truth. Crimes against humanity do not fade with time, and those who commit them cannot hide forever. Justice may be delayed, and punishment may take different forms, but history has shown that truth has a way of surfacing, and the reckoning, when it comes, is inevitable. Perhaps most importantly, these accounts serve as a reminder to guard the values that protect our humanity: empathy, respect for life, and the courage to stand against cruelty, even when it is sanctioned by authority. The women in these stories surrendered those values and became instruments of suffering. In remembering their victims and the horrors they endured, we commit ourselves to resisting the forces, whether political, social, or personal, that would lead us down a similar path. In the end, this video is not just a chronicle of brutality. It is a plea for vigilance. It tells us that history can repeat itself if we let memory fade and moral responsibility weaken. The past demands that we remain alert, speak out against injustice, and protect the dignity of every human being. That is the legacy we must choose, one that rejects the path of blood and embraces the principles that keep the world from falling into darkness again.